This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Can I welcome everyone to the Police and Crime Committee meeting. This morning we will be holding a discussion on the Mayor's draft Police and Crime Plan for 2025 and 2029. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any interruptions. Can I now ask our clerk, Lauren Harvey, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. I've received apologies from Assembly Member Moema.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Noted. Thank you. Can we confirm the minutes of the meetings held on 4th of December 2024 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the committee and the additional correspondence sent and received? Thank you. We now move on to our main item of business, and I would like to welcome our first panel of guests. Professor Ben Bradford, Director of the Centre for Global City Policing, University College London, welcome. And Sophia Warringer, Deputy Policy Director, Centre for Social Justice. Welcome, Sophia. We're waiting for Professor Jyoti Bera from the Professor of Policing for the University of College of London, and I hope she'll just join us as we go in. So thank you. So I'll start off the questions. So to both of you, what emerging trends will shape crime and policing in London over the next 4 years and in the longer term? I don't know which one of you would like to take that first. Ben.
Yeah, thanks. I've written 4 things down. There probably could be more. I think increasing social and economic strain on society and the police is going to generate more crime of certain types, more demand on the police of certain types, and obviously diminishes the ability of the police to respond to that demand because budgets are constrained. So there's an issue there. Increasing social fragmentation, debate, contest of the kind that we see in the United States. I think it would be surprising if we didn't start to see more of that in this country as well. In fact, we already are, given the events of last summer. To bring it more locally into London, trouble with recruitment and retention in policing is a significant issue now, and it's going to become more and more of a significant issue, I think, for a whole host of reasons, not least to do with pay. Increasing complexity of crime investigation as everything is online. Almost any crime now comes with gigabytes of social media and other data that needs to be analysed by the police doing the investigation, which is one of the reasons why I think detection rates have gone down so far. It's just so complicated to investigate crime. Yeah. And the final one, that was 5, wasn't it, is conflicting demands on the police from multiple levels of oversight and governance. So in the Met is obviously particularly prone to this, local, national, international, and navigating the way through those demands, I think is going to be increasingly difficult for police organisations.
Okay, so if you're looking at scrutiny, I mean, that we've also now got the London Board, which actually stops officers... Sorry? Which stops officers coming to this particular committee, which is causing us severe problems. And bearing in mind we come with very different views on policing, we assume that this is where the office should be coming, but they're not. They're going to the unelected London Policing Board. I'm sure we'll come back to that. I'm coming to you next, Sophia, but Professor Bella, welcome. The first question, and I'll come to you after, Sophia, is what emerging trends will shape crime and policing in London over the next 4 years and in the longer term? So I'll come to you after we hear what Sophia has to say about that.
So some things that we've picked up from our research is the inflection point of the COVID-19 pandemic, seeing a trajectory upwards in particular types of kind of violent crime, particularly knife crime, but also alongside that, looking back over the past 5 years to where we were 5 years ago, a rising number of the use of firearms as well as knives in that kind of violent crime category. One of the kind of research activities that the Centre for Social Justice has conducted found that 10% of Londoners knew somebody or had a connection with somebody with an illegal firearm, which feels like a staggering amount, and obviously a huge increase from 5 years ago. So that seems to be a trend that is coming down the tracks quickly. And
Sorry, can I ask you to repeat those percentages again?
Yes, so 10% of the people that we did on a London-wide poll knew someone or had a connection with someone who had an illegal firearm or had had one in the
Good
past.
God, and what was your base? How many people did answer that?
That was a 2,000 person survey, then extrapolated out to reflect the demography of London representatively.
That's very high, isn't it?
And obviously, therefore, in some communities that figure is likely to be higher and lower in others, depending on the kind of demographic. So that seems to be a trend that will potentially continue. And something, of course, that at the Centre for Social Justice we're really very passionate about is the impact on the most disadvantaged. We know that the most disadvantaged are disproportionately impacted by crime, and so those trends also kind of continuing this almost enclave of parallel societies where you have particular communities that are disproportionately impacted, living alongside geographically often very closely to those who are not so much impacted by crime, and that gap between those two communities just widening. And I think another issue that will come up over the next 5 years is the perception of crime, which can in fact exist very differently from the reality of what the crime numbers are saying. And in fact, there's been some great work on bringing lots of different types of crime numbers down, but unfortunately the perception of London is that they are more unsafe than ever when you speak to them and when you poll them, which exists completely differently from the reality of what the data is saying. But that perception issue is really important, both in terms of trust in the police and also, of course, kind of feeling of safety in neighbourhoods and community participation. And I think, unfortunately, various aspects of police conduct, but also kind of political messaging, has meant that that perception of distrust has only been inflamed over the last 5 years. And I do think over the next 5, there will be a lot of work needed to try and bring back that perception issue more in line with what the figures are actually saying.
Do you not think, though, that social media plays a big part in that?
Yes, absolutely. I do think so. And therefore, people's attention is grabbed by things which were already happening on a very similar level, but suddenly they feel more pertinent or close to home. So I do think, yeah, social media has a role in that. Also, police kind of media coverage of police conduct and particular cases, I guess, against police officers as well, all feed into that. So it's complex drivers.
Thank you for that. Professor Barrow, what's your views?
Thank you. Thanks, Ben. I won't go over things that they've said, so I'll sort of focus on 3 areas that would be interesting. One is the whole confusion around police training currently that's going on with the different routes into policing and the kind of training that's given to recruit officers is quite concerning. We don't know how that's going to play out, and that refers to the whole composition of the force in terms of the lack of retention of senior officers with a lot of experience who are bleeding away, and the force is made up of a lot of young officers who don't have the experience, and we'll have to see how the change in training over the last few years is going to pan out in terms of how the kind of policing services that they offer. So my concern is around whether the training that is currently being offered is both at the recruit level but also for senior specialized roles, whether that's adequate and whether that would be enough to meet the demands of changing crime in London. So that was the first area. The second area that I have concerns about is the move towards the use of data and technology to address some of these crime issues. Whilst it seems really, and for many parts of policing, it would be appropriate and useful for police officers, but there needs to be some sort of check on the ethical sides of how this data is being used, the impact of automating a lot of the decisions that police officers are using. It's kind of almost as if the algorithm tells us it's okay, rather than looking at what's going into the algorithm. So that's a concern. The use of automated technologies like LFR, like retrospective facial recognition, and all of these things again need scrutiny, need accountability, need transparency, which is so. Over the next 5 years, I would keep a wary eye on how the police are using data to shape their policies and practice. And the third thing, which sort of leads on from what Sophia was saying was trust in the police, and I'm kind of focusing more on women and their trust in the police. So there's a lot of focus on WOG and increasing reporting, but I think we also need to look at it's all right to get people to report, but how are the police responding to those women who are reporting, whether the response of the police is appropriate. So talking about supporting women through the criminal justice system, as the plan does, is great. But at the first point of contact, that makes all the difference. So whether police officers are responding appropriately to victims, especially female victims of crime, when they do come forward, is something, again, that I think the Met will have to work on to gain the trust of women, to get them to come and access services.
Okay, thank you for those various suggestions. You have all read the draft police and crime plan, yeah. Because the next question, the draft police and crime plan has many of the same priority areas as the Mayor's current police and crime plan. So do you think that's the right approach? Are there other areas that should be prioritised other than what you've just told us, the ones that you think? But I mean, it's more or less the same as last time. Is there a difference that you like, or is there anything specific around the policies other than that you've just said? If I go back, that's the same way, if that's all right.
Yeah, I think the overall priorities are kind of set by the wider agenda around all these issues, clearly, and that hasn't really changed since last time. I don't think we're still all talking about very similar things to what we were talking about 4 or 5 years ago, whenever it was. I mean, for me, I mean, we may come on to this later, the one thing that is lacking, and I don't think this is an issue for the police and crime plan per se, it's an issue for policing full stop, and everyone who sits around policing, is what we do with online crime and all the multifarious versions of that. And while there's allusion to that in here, and that there's some policies and things set out, I think collectively we're very far away from working out what a response to that looks like. So how do we deal with crime facilitated by the Internet of Things? How do we deal with crime that happens in the metaverse? All this kind of stuff. And I suspect one of the reasons for that is because that's not within the remit of the ability of MOPAC to solve on its own. There's national and international problems.
Thing is, though, it does give us a direction of travel. This one isn't dissimilar from the last one. One could argue there are very many more issues. You've pointed out some very, very good points. Do you not feel that some of the things that you've pointed out should actually be put in more detail into this plan?
I mean, I think it touches on most of the areas I would have expected it to touch on, to be honest, both in terms of what we're talking about and where the highest harm is. I mean, Jyoti's already talked about violence against women and girls. I would have absolutely expected a large part of this to be talking about violence against women and girls, serious knife crime and homicide. I mean, that they just seem to be kind of no-brainers in some sense. That's what we need to be looking at. I think, and again, I'm not sure this is an issue for MOPAC or for London. These are national and international issues. I mean, so there's some discussion, I think, about the Mayor using his influence with social media companies and with central government. I mean, more of that would be helpful to start, all of us, to start thinking more about these kind of bigger issues.
Well, also, there's the funding package. The Mayor does have a very large budget. Sophia.
Thank you. Yeah, so I do think I can kind of go through the 4 priorities that are laid out there and taking the kind of first 2 together in the violent crime kind of category, so those reduced knife crime with injury and violent knife-enabled robbery. I think that is absolutely a priority for Londoners and therefore should be a priority for the police. And I think something that we found in our research is that the enforcement response to that needs to be front and centre. And so there's obviously lots of preventative work that needs to be done, but I think there needs to be clear messaging on the positive role of stop and search in cracking down on that kind of violent crime. And actually our research has shown that this is supported by the overwhelming majority of Londoners from all ethnic and disadvantaged backgrounds, and they want to see more of it, particularly increased actually over the last 5 years. They've seen a more positive response to it, and I think a lot of that is due to more positive communication and education of police officers, so that when they are conducting these stops and searches, they are communicating more effectively and compassionately and calmly with those who they are searching, and that has led to a greater awareness and education about its purpose in the kind of wide-ranging toolkit of reducing violence on our streets. And I think that is something that the Mayor needs to be very kind of bold about, talking about the positive impacts, particularly when we can see that even those who are disproportionately impacted by stop and search are overwhelmingly still positive about its kind of use as the toolkit for policing. The other thing that I would want to bring up is the focus on bringing perpetrators of VAUG to justice, and of course a kind of preventative measure on that is tackling misogyny, and something that is key to doing that is integrating the health service, which is often a very trusted point of contact for many people, as a early warning flagging system for incidences of domestic violence. And actually London has done some great work on using that touch point as a way of early flagging people who are victims of domestic violence. Of course, overwhelmingly women and girls, but let's not forget up to a third of victims are also men, and potentially not just couple relationships, but also a growing number of kind of parent to child or child to family member violence as well. So seeing that as part of the whole reducing violence strategy will be really important. Of course, those 2 things are very much linked as well, and children who have that experience of domestic violence at home are often more likely to seek comfort and time away from the home to avoid that violent situation, and therefore are more vulnerable to criminal exploitation. And I do welcome the focus on tackling violence and women for women and girls. I think it's incredibly important, but let's remember as well that in the 2023 cohort of victims of homicide in London, the overwhelming majority, 81%, were men. So this is something that is important to kind of bring into the fray as well. And the final thing, therefore, you have is on criminal exploitation. And actually, again, London is leading the way in many parts of the country in tackling that, both as a kind of form of modern slavery, but also in all of its forms. And I think that there is more to be done on data sharing, so that there is a clear kind of the police are anonymising, of course, but collecting the data of people who appeal to the modern slavery defence, so the kind of statutory defence of modern slavery when being charged or kind of going through the process of charging for crimes that are related to their exploitation, and a better kind of data sharing of that. It doesn't have to be set from the Home Office, it could be brought in from the police force themselves, and would help us understand the kind of the drivers of that, because obviously often London acts as a hub for County Lines organisation to other towns and cities across the country. So it's a key way of preventing that kind of exploitation spreading. And then the final thing, I guess, is on what I think might be missing from this. And I do think, again, back to that perception issue, the so-called signal crimes that are seen often as maybe more low level, but it's what really matter to people, of their perception of safety in the city. And they are things like what might be called petty crime, shoplifting, antisocial behaviour, the feeling of kind of will the police come if they have a brick through their car window or things like that. That is so important in enabling people to feel safe. So that doesn't seem to come up quite as strongly as I would like in the strategy, because I think that is goes a long way to dealing with that perception issue, which is an important part in building the trust process.
And of course, trust and confidence. Thank you. I'm sorry, you've come third again. Is there anything the other two have said that not said?
Thanks, Ben. So in terms of the areas that this policing crime plan is covering, it's quite broad-ranging, and you can always keep adding more stuff. So it's a question of whether we want to go in for surface covering of everything, because we know
No, I just wondered if there's something specific.
I think what's missing really is a lot of the, not detail, but how these aims are going to be achieved. So you talk about public health approaches, but what does that involve? Or you talk about effective interventions to hold perpetrators of WOG to account. What does that actually involve? So I don't know whether that's within the remit of the plan, but in terms of the areas it's covering, as Ben said, it seems to touch on all the areas that are expected, and whilst they might be the same as the last plan, clearly those haven't been achieved, which is why this.
No, well, they have to do one every 4 years, but I mean, you've picked up on it, and many of us have. It's like word spaghetti or whatever they call it these days. There's not proper KPIs in there. There's nothing that we can easily hold them to account on, and this is very similar to the one before. All the detail is kept in different places, which is difficult for those of us that are trying to scrutinise. But thank you for your views, and we'll.
Sorry, one last point. In terms of evaluations also, so a lot of the new things that the police are putting into place, there aren't enough evaluations, or if they are being conducted in-house. So it's like you're marking your own homework.
Yes,
so
yes.
That's another issue.
100%. And we've brought this up on numerous occasions, and I'm glad we didn't put any words into to you. This is exactly how we feel. So I'm very pleased that's come out. My colleague, Assembly Member Roberts, beg your pardon, is going to come in with a quick question here.
Yes, very quick question. And it really sort of feeds into this business that you raised, Ben, about there needs to be more of a national approach on some of the issues. And Jyoti, you mentioned a few other things. Is this almost bound to fail to an extent such as the previous plan failed because it's trying to achieve too much? Are there things which should be dealt with, as you suggest, at a national level? Are there any things in here which you think we really should be taking out and looking at as a national level approach?
That's a good question. I think it would be difficult to go through this document and identify things that we think shouldn't be a focus of policing, frankly. Whether that means there isn't too much in there, I think, as Jyoti suggests, is another question. As obviously it comes down to priorities and where you're going to put your focus. And I think in an ideal world, one way I would solve your problem is to make policing much more responsive to the demands placed on it by the public. So actually less priority setting from the centre and more emphasis on responding on the demands placed on the police, primarily with public, but also with public services as well. I think we're a long way away from that at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
I think just adding on to Ben's point of asking, sort of letting the agenda be set by the public. There's a lot here about neighbourhood policing, about the whole clear, hold and build strategy, and a lot of it is about clear. There's nothing about hold and build. There's nothing about good old-fashioned neighbourhood policing in here, which is just out of fashion these days. It's all about using data and tagging knife offenders and things like that, which is good. But it probably is sort of losing some of its key or core issues that it should be working with the public rather than answering to priorities that have been set by someone else. But yeah, I mean, in terms of taking anything out, if you take anything out, you'll have one section of society screaming. So they're in a difficult position. I kind of understand why there's so much in there.
Thank you.
Nothing really further to add to that. Thanks.
That's fine. Could I just ask one more question, Chair? I appreciate I'm straining at the leisure. You will be familiar with other police and crime plans from other comparable cities. How does this measure up on a scale of 1 to 10?
From my limited experience, they're all much of a muchness. Obviously, the specific content is going to vary from place to place, but they all have a very similar tone and broadly similar content from what I've seen, which isn't very much.
Thank you. All the same. Yep. Sophia?
Yeah, I think similar. I think it's often very hard to measure the impact, or at least they don't set themselves up to be easy to measure the impact. So then one fades away and one is replaced by the kind of next one, and without much kind of scrutiny on what has gone before. And I think that is unfortunately similar kind of across the country.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for those. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Very briefly from Lord Bailey.
Morning, Professor. Ben, you talked about public priorities, but how do you avoid then the usual suspects getting their problems addressed and communities with no voice not having their So, for instance, we do lots of work around Vorg, which is correct, but black boys are murdered at a much higher rate, but we don't have the same kind of public visibility. So how would you avoid that?
Well, that's the $64 million question. I haven't got an answer to it. Not in the short term, anyway. I mean, I think in the medium to long term, it would be the kind of things that Jyothi's already alluded to, actually making neighbourhood, making community policing really mean something, and also empowering those other voices so they don't get drowned out. So there's a political question there, which is kind of above my pay grade. But yeah, I think we're a long way away from that, which is why you wouldn't necessarily want to say, tomorrow, that's what we're going to do. There's a whole set of other things you'd have to put in place before we got there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Right, we're now moving on to reducing violence and criminal exploitation. We're starting with Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, panel. Before I start my official question, Ms Warringer, could I pick up on something that you said a few minutes ago, which I found absolutely fascinating? You said about male victims, and that we are actually looking about, potentially a third of those victims being male. Can I ask what you think needs to happen to enable... I mean, I think I'm not overgeneralising when I say that it is harder for men to come forward and say that they're victims, particularly in, as you described, as a domestic setting. What needs to happen to enable that coming forward and feeling confident that those issues will be taken up?
Thank you. So I do think a big part of this is the success of the Vorg kind of vocal campaign, which has been brilliant. And what they have done really well is that public health messaging around reducing stigma, reducing or increasing accesses to services, although I know, of course, they're on never enough for women and girls. And I think there needs to be that kind of follow-on piece conversation about the victims that don't fit into that category. And I think the public health kind of campaign around that it goes a long way to explaining why men and other victims feel like it's harder for them to come forward. Of course, there are very few specific charities and support organisations and other kind of refuges that cater to their needs as well. So looking at that, it will be important because it's harder for them to know where to go if they have that experience. And also the shame element, of course, impacts women and girls too, but also kind of compounded often because of the stigma associated with being a male victim. And often the perpetrators are still male. It's often in relationships or within family members or a kind of partner in kind of intimate partner violence where it's actually a two-way kind of abusive relationship. And so kind of more conversations about that all the way through the education system and through the public health campaigning, and also from champions. I think we've had very powerful spokespeople talking about violence against women and girls from their own experience and really bringing that into the light, and yet we've not had the kind of complete revolution on the male victim side, and I think we need some of those powerful voices to come through, which will help to reduce the stigma.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So my question now is for all of you. The draft police and crime plan identifies 4 priority aims to reduce violence and criminal exploitation. Are these the right areas of focus for London? And if you agree with that, why do you agree with that? So I wonder if we could start with Professor Bradford, please.
Yes, for reasons discussed before. I think they naturally suggest themselves, given where we are politically and the public concerns about these issues. I guess taking a step back, the issue would be, can the Met walk and chew gum? In other words, can it concentrate on these crimes and do all the other things that it needs to do? So I'm thinking here particularly around issues like theft of mobile phones and theft of bicycles. They're quite rightly not priorities. We're prioritising the most high harm crimes, but we know that the poor response to those kinds of crimes damages trust and confidence. Actually, probably much more than the responses to the more serious crimes, because they're much more common. And everyone's got a story about them or their friend having their mobile phone stolen on their bike and the police not doing anything about it. And those stories are really damaging. So the question is not whether they're the right priorities. I think broadly they are. Can we avoid prioritisation in that sense coming at the expense of lots of the other things that the police need to do to maintain public trust, among other things?
Thank you. Professor Bella.
I think they're fairly the right kinds of areas to focus on. It's just how they focus on this, and I think carrying on from Sophia's point about increasing the ability for male victims to come forward and report. Putting domestic abuse and things like sex work under the vogue agenda automatically begins to exclude men and trans members of society from feeling that they are being looked after. So some of the work that we did with the policing of sex work in London for the Met and for MOPAC suggested that the police have a number of aims that they want to achieve in this space, in the vogue space. So they want to increase trust, they also want to get intelligence, they also want to target clients of sex workers, but all of these aims actually work against each other. So if you're trying to achieve one aim, it actually leads to reducing some. So there is a lot of conflict between the number of aims, and I think Ben did talk about the fact that they're trying to achieve so many different goals. Some of them are counterproductive, and so there isn't a lack or there isn't good sort of conversation between these aims. And in fact, frankly, our research suggested that the police should do less in this space, but whatever they're doing, they should do it well. So one of the biggest problems with the vogue agenda is it considers all sex work to be violence against women. And we've talked to sex workers and organizations that represent sex work, and they say, but that's not true. And sort of right at the outset, you have a clash between the community for whom the police are policing and the community's desires of what they expect of the police. So they expect the police just treat us decently as victims when we come to you, when we have become victims of crime, rather than treating us as victims from day one. So there are issues there where overall those aims seem okay, but within those broad aims there are a number of outcomes or number of agendas that the police have which might actually be counterproductive. So a little more thought to what the police should be achieving in each of these areas is really important.
Thank you. Ms. Warringer.
Thank you. So I think just to briefly add to that, I think that it's really important that the full understanding of criminal exploitation is embedded into the police training practice, and therefore those kind of red flags are picked up as a normal consequence of any officer interacting with someone who may be a victim of criminal exploitation. Unfortunately, we still see too many people being kind of prosecuted and treated as victims when actually they are kind of being exploited, particularly through county lines, particularly those who are under 18. And obviously then that sets the trajectory of their life of or can do, of what and the harms and the challenges that they then have to overcome. And this is where I guess there are limits to what the Met Police on their own can do. And going back to that question of the national picture, because these webs are so interconnected across the country, and people, the kind of kingpins of these exploitation gangs and rings, as they were, are not necessarily within the remit of the Met. They may even be abroad, or they may be in other jurisdictions. So it's important that that is a kind of national approach, and data is shared between forces, so that when people are moved or moved to a different part of the country, then those kind of understandings can go with them.
Thank you. My next question is for Professor Bello. I think you have touched on a lot of these issues, but if there is anything else that you'd like to add, what progress have MOPAC and the Met made in tackling violence against women and girls in London? And is there any new thinking or approaches that should be considered? And I appreciate that you've been talking about this since the meeting started.
Thank you. I think they have been doing some things that have been really good, but as I said before, there's very little evaluation, so there's very little to say that, oh, this has been good practice, let's continue it. Some of the things in the area of violence against women and girls has been quite a bit of flavour of the month. So if today this is important, a lot of resources are put into it, and something seems to be working well. And yet tomorrow somebody else comes in, it's not that important anymore, resources are withdrawn from it. So there's no consistency in how some of these areas and interventions are carried on, and they aren't carried on long enough for the results to be seen. It's sort of quite short-termism, which is true of policing generally. It's not of the Met. So they have been doing some good work, but it hasn't been consistent, and it requires a lot more systematic evaluation to support officers who've been doing some good work, but then don't have the support of the senior leadership because they don't have anything to show them to say, look, this has been working, and it's been evaluated, and it's objective. So I think if they want to continue embedding good practice, a little more thought, a little more consistency, a little more evaluation needs to be the order of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Garbutt, do you still want to come in on this?
Yes, and really picks up on what you were just saying there, Jyoti, about evidence. My question was going to be on how do we hear how the police make decisions about how they use their resources? Like, how do they do cost-benefit analysis? And it does pick up on exactly what you were just saying. So I used to work in the NHS, and we had to do a lot of that to justify things that we were doing, and it doesn't feel to me the same happens in the police.
No, it doesn't happen similarly in the police. And the police kind of tend to say, be driven by what's effective. And a lot of times effectiveness is not defined clearly. So the aim of a particular intervention at the start, what you hoping to achieve, has not been set out. That's one issue. And not every intervention that is effective may be either a just or a fair or a desirable intervention. So I think this is where a lot more consultation with the public in terms of how they go about doing some of these interventions would be necessary, and also being a bit more transparent and accountable. So accountability structures, again, in some of these areas are probably maybe not quite as robust as they should be.
That's really helpful, because also the plan talks a lot about taking a public health approach. I'm really interested in drug policing, and the Faculty of Public Health and the Royal Society of Public Health talk about decriminalisation of drugs being the best public health approach, and it just doesn't feel like that's reflected in a policing or the Mayor of London's approach. Yeah, I don't know how they take on, I don't know if you know if they take on advice from faculties and royal societies.
So we're talking, I mean, I can talk about sex work because that's just what I've been doing. So decriminalisation of sex work, again, has been considered to be really successful and sort of positive in other countries where they have decrim. But when we even at the national level, it's not just London-wide, but the whole attitude is that's not something we're going to even look at, or the consultation with relevant communities who would be affected one way or the other is not quite, because these are traditionally communities that are anti-police. The police are reluctant to engage with them, and they are now reluctant to engage with the police because they've been called and they've been consulted 1,000,000 times and nothing happens, and they've just said it's a waste of our time, which then sort of alienates communities that the police should be actually supporting and working for. So
that's really helpful. Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, and I've heard that before. Ben, I accept that not everything can go in there. I mean, you've all touched on other things, but if you look at the incredible increase in anti-Semitism we've seen in London recently, do you think that tackles issues around hate crime, extremism and terrorism enough within the crime plan? Do you think it should have said more on those lines?
It's not really my area of expertise. It seemed okay. I think I would have expected more on the online environment and the interplay. I mean, we need to stop talking about online and offline. On world, everyone's online all the time. It's more complicated than that, isn't it? I would have expected to see more on that, because that's clearly a really important driver of a lot of this behaviour. But again, we're then back in that's not a London issue. That's what tech billionaires in California are doing, have direct implications here. And I think one of the biggest challenges for all locally based police organisations, which are all our police organisations, is how they address those issues. And I'm not sure this is the best place to think of doing it.
Okay, I know it's not expertise of anybody on the panel, which is fair enough. I just thought I'd ask that. Assembly Member Duval, did you want to come in, or has it been answered? No, it's fine. It's fine. Okay, thank you. We're now going to move on to increasing trust and confidence. We've touched on this a little bit, and my colleague, Assembly Member Roberts, is going to take the next couple of questions.
Thank you, Chair. This is a question for Ben. Are the commitments in the draft plan to improve trust and confidence in the Met and to reduce disparities sufficient? And if not, what more could be done?
I think it says all the right things. It says the things that I would have expected. The key will be delivery, and whether the things that are said actually translate into practice on the ground. So we know that the most important things shaping people's trust and confidence in the police is their own experiences, the experiences of their friends and families, and what they see in their immediate social and physical environment. And if police want to change levels of public trust and confidence, they need to attend to those things, which means neighbourhood policing, which means reassurance policing, which means community policing, which means engagement with communities in all the ways that we've all been discussing. And all that's in the report. Whether it actually transpires is another question. And of course, over the last few years, it's proven very difficult for the Met and other forces to do this stuff because there are so many competing demands. So you're always hearing about neighbourhood teams that exist on paper, but not in reality because they're being abstracted all the time to deal with other pressing issues. And that, again, that's not an issue just for the Met, that's an issue nationally. So how you actually do the things that you say you're going to do, I think, remains an open question. The only thing I would add is I think I would have expected to see more about engagement with the LGBTQ community, because we know that that's one of the biggest challenges. If you look at all the charts, LGBTQ people are way below everyone else and on a significant downward trajectory. And there is mention in there, and you could make the argument that that's what community policing means. It means engaging with different communities. But a bit more detail on that I would have thought would have been welcome because of this particular challenge with those communities at the moment.
Do you think that the draft plan that we have in front of us, it's a London plan, but we know that there are two types of London. There's zone 3 to outside and there's zones 1 to 3. Do you think it's a bit too focused on the needs of central London and what people would think of the city, and does it address thoroughly, do you think, the needs of the outer London boroughs?
Hadn't crossed my mind. I mean, mainly because if you look at the map of, for example, high violent crime locations, Croydon is on that map, and that's there's a lot of emphasis and a lot of work going on in Croydon in various ways at the moment. So no, I wouldn't necessarily have said that. And of course, it's also the case that, for example, members of the LGBTQ community live all over London, and many of them live in outer London. So no, I don't think so.
No, that's fair enough. Yeah. And just this is a question for everybody, if they'd like, is how effectively does the draft police and crime plan address tech-enabled abuse, online crime and fraud, and what, if anything, in that particular scenario is missing from the plan?
I didn't quite understand why this was in the trust and confidence section. Oh. Which it is. I mean, it is in the document, and I'm not sure that that's the biggest driver of low levels of trust and confidence in the police. Okay. People tend not to blame the police for crime. They tend to think that the response to crime is more police. So, yeah. And these aren't the most important crimes that people blame their banks, or they think it's just a fact of life, and these kinds of things. So I wasn't quite sure why it was there, but the bigger question is, yes, of course, we all collectively need to do much more about these forms of offending and victimisation. And I think there is a note in there about the mayor and others trying to put pressure on social media and tech companies to do more, and that kind of preventative work is going to be absolutely key to this, and that doesn't involve the police. It involves encouraging other actors to do the kinds of things that they need to do to make their platforms or whatever it is more secure.
Sophie?
I would just echo that when our research nationally and in London, when we ask people what the worst thing about their area is, crime predominantly comes up as the answer, but not once does kind of online crime or fraud come up as part of that explanation. And I think what people really associate with crime is seeing their police officers around, the broken car windows, the kind of perception of the cleanliness of the street, the antisocial behaviour, the smelling of drugs in the air, the kind of viewing of drug transitions and transactions happening in front of them, and whether there's an enforced police response to that. So I think that is really key. If I may go back to a previous point very briefly, just on the decriminalising of drugs agenda, our research from looking at what has happened across the world, I think it's really important to hear from what police have said makes their job harder or easier. And you may be aware that Germany have recently decriminalised the personal possession of certain types of drugs, and the police force have come out very strongly saying this has made their job harder. It has not decimated the illegal market. The same has happened in New York, where cannabis has been legalised. It is and in Canada, over 50% of the market is still caused by the illegal
It's not,
market.
It's down to 10% that people access drugs from... Sorry, some of that's incorrect.
Well, come on afterwards. Let our guest finish, please. Carry on.
So this is something that just needs to be taken into account, and the Vancouver police chief herself has come out very strongly saying what has happened in Vancouver has, yes, it has reduced crime, because obviously there are less crimes to commit because the possession of these substances are not any longer a crime, but it has not reduced drug deaths over the long term. It has not reduced addiction, and in Portugal, which is often held up as the kind of a blueprint of where it has worked well, what has really seen the decrease in the number of drug deaths is the boosting of the treatment sector alongside the kind of legal framework changing, and when the treatment sector has been defunded, the drug deaths have gone back up again. So I just wanted to kind of add that to the debate.
Okay, thank you.
If we can just keep to what's in the... that's lovely.
So I mean, considering the fact that tech-enabled abuses come under public confidence and trust, I'm just wondering whether the public's trust and confidence in the police really rests upon how well the police respond to online crime, because I don't think the public really expect the police to have the technical know-how. They probably, if your credit card's been cloned or whatever, you've been hacked, you'd rather get the banks to return the money and you're fairly happy. But if your phone's been stolen and the police haven't responded to you for 13 days to your complaint, that really upsets them. So there are two aspects to this. A lot of tech-enabled online crime probably is not even reported to the police. It goes to the vendor, or it goes to the insurance companies, because people don't expect the police to probably the low-level, everyday fraud. The sort of in terms of trust, rather than tech-enabled abuse, I'm just sort of going slightly to tech-enabled policing. When you've turned all your, all the reporting to reporting online, that the human element, the fact of reassurance when you go into a police station and somebody talks to you nicely and somebody takes a report and you have a human being responding to you, that's now been slowly, completely taken away. And that, again, is a huge area where the police could establish trust and confidence of the public by giving them that response, which increasingly is all automated and taken away. So, again, resources are an issue, I understand that, but it does impact negatively on how trustworthy the police appear to the public.
Yeah, it's one of those tricky things, isn't it? I know that in my patch there's a lot of work done on particularly education to older residents regarding online fraud and what have you. And it's what that addresses is the fear of crime. And then that in itself, if that fear of crime, if they're given the tools to address and protect themselves, then their fear of crime goes down, and that sort of perhaps has a knock-on effect with the trust and confidence thing, but it's tangential, I do appreciate. Chair, thank you.
Thank you. Can we put a note in the notes to say that Assemblymember Garbett disagreed with some of that, and we'll go into that later. I don't want to. No,
yeah,
I really don't want
I was going to just say apologies, Sophia, but yeah, thank you,
Chair. That's okay. No problems. We'll look into that. We've now got 2 members, but can you keep it short, please, because we've got to keep on time. Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
With trust and confidence in the police, I come to the. To Sophie, with trust and confidence in the police, how important do you think low-level crime, what is traditionally known as antisocial behaviour, is important?
Yeah, I believe it's very important for building those relationships, and it's seeing the police commonly out on the neighbourhood. When our surveys have shown that when the public in London are asked what they want from the police, the #1 priority is local police that they see on the beat, and the second priority, interestingly, is that education piece as well, so engaging with young people in schools and building those positive perceptions of police from an early age. And I think that all feeds into that feeling, again, of, I've said before, this kind of perception of safety and building positive relationships and seeing the police as part of the kind of community. And I do think that antisocial behaviour is often very underreported. People don't necessarily go to the police with it as a problem. They don't think the police will have the resource or the time to deal with it, but it's something that weighs very heavily on their minds and obviously impacts their ability to kind of engage in the community, to potentially leave the house and go out, and particularly after dark for more vulnerable residents, particularly elderly people. And so therefore that restricts their ability to participate in the city and feeds into things like loneliness and isolation. So there's kind of far-reaching consequences of that not being tackled as a priority.
To either one of the professors, the question was asked about what does the plan have. You've sort of said it has largely the right things, but for me it's a matter of emphasis, and it would feel like this topic, antisocial behaviour, isn't emphasised enough. Do you think it would have been useful to bring it to the fore, particularly when you look at how low trust and confidence is in the police in London?
So, I mean to agree with what Sophia was saying, antisocial behaviour, low-level disorder is absolutely fundamental to people's trust in the police. The kind of complexity comes, a lot of that is not really the response of the police to deal with. So people will infer from just the conditions of their social environment that structures of social ordering are effective or not. And if they see litter, if they see dog mess, if they see broken windows, that will affect their trust of the police. But is it the police's job to deal with those things?
I have come from a youth work background. The interaction between youth, community, youth and the police and the community, where I came from, almost exclusively drove how people felt about the police or not.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, absolutely. As I said, the most important thing for people's level of trust is personal contact with police officers, fundamentally. But most people don't have personal contact with the police. From what I think, one of the tensions in the plan, and one of the tensions on all efforts around this area, is we're tracking a population level trust and confidence in the police. That's what the PAS does. I mean, there's some intersectional analysis, but basically we're looking at the population of London. 70% of those people have almost no contact with the police from one year to the next. But what they do is they infer from information that's in their environment whether this organisation is trustworthy or not. So if you want to affect these big population level figures, you have to look at what's driving that, and that's low-level disorder of the kind we've been discussing. That isn't the kind of people that you're talking about, have very real personal experiences of policing. So that's difficult for us, and this is not just a Mopac or a London problem, this is a national problem. It's kind of how we square that circle, that we're tracking things at the population level, which may be driven in very different ways to actually people at the sharp end of crime and policing who have personal experiences.
Thank you. It's a very good point. It's a very good point. Well made. Thank you.
Thank you. Assemblymember Duval.
In terms of the trust and confidence issue, it's not clear, is it? Because there are some issues where you get high levels of trust and confidence or reasonable levels of trust and confidence. In other areas, we know we get less. And so can I just be clear in terms of some of your previous answers around trust and confidence? Response is key. But one of the things I have reading this plan is I'm not clear what role is the community expected to play in tackling crime alongside the other agencies? And it's either in the language, and should there be explicit, and it's a two-way process. If I want to be in a decent society, I've got to be a decent citizen and play my part, reporting crime, helping and supporting those agencies in tackling crime. Is it made easier by the police? I'm not sure. I think it was something, Joyty, you said about how do you contact the police? How do you, if you've got some information that's vital, if you are not familiar with the processes that we have and you're not going into your police station because you think that's not a place for me to go to, what are the pathways in? Should we not be looking more about this community interaction on trust and confidence, not just from the agency's point of view, which are welcome? I think they need to change their attitudinal, cultural issues around how they carry out their tasks. But how do we allow this public engagement process, whether you come into contact with the police and get a bad service, or whether you want to come into contact with the police because you want to help and support them in their work, or even other agencies in tackling crime, because it's not just the police. Should we not be looking at something a bit more concrete, as others have suggested maybe, and bringing that together and around the trust and confidence issue? What's your thinking about that?
I think it goes back to the original point that all three of us have made about neighbourhood policing, but there's also this issue about consultation with the public, and there's again a piece that needs to be done. You have neighbourhood ward meetings, and it's the usual suspects, and there are 4 people who turn up, and there's hardly anything, and that's because of the experience people have had, that it's only a one-way communication with the police. They just take, they never come back. And that's been identified for years now and hasn't been addressed. The fact that there isn't this two-way communication. So if you are asking the public for their opinion, the public would then like to know what you've done about it. Or even if you haven't done anything about it, why might that be so? And I don't think the public would expect you to do everything that they ask you to, and it's what Lord Bailey said about certain voices not being heard, and that is a problem. And again, it's worth thinking about whether it is the job of the police, which it is, to go out and make the effort to engage those communities and get those voices. But to do that, they need to have trust. In order to build the trust, they've got to be there, which they aren't now. And so it's sort of contingent on each other.
Very briefly, I think you make a very good point that it cannot all lay on the police and the community kind of infrastructure organisations that previously may have supported that kind of community cohesion have often been hollowed out. We think about youth clubs, community groups, faith groups, for example. They had a very real role in providing that community cohesion, and unfortunately those numbers have just gone down. So I think that is very true. We are asking more than ever of our police from less resources, and those pillars that would normally come around to support them are unfortunately being eroded as well.
If I may, I think another issue here is it's very easy to suggest that there's a techno fix for this, which is shifting stuff online. I think policing is just an innately kind of human interaction, and it falls into the same category for me as why people are being encouraged back into the office and why international firms spend billions of pounds flying people around the world for meetings where they could have them online. There's just something about interacting with a person during moments of stress and tension, which is often what happens when people contact the police, that you can't take away. And I think there are some concerning trends in British policing, again, this is not a London-only issue, to try and provide techno fixes, to try and push people online. And you're just making it more difficult for people to have the kind of interactions with police that they want that will generate trust further down the line.
Thank you.
Thank you. And of course, it's going to be worse if we lose the 2,300 police, as it looks like we will in the budget submission. So we shall see. So we're now moving on to improving the criminal justice system and supporting victims. And my colleague, Assemblymember Garbett's going to take this.
Yeah, just to focus on victim support, really, and how you think that what is needing to ensure that victims get better support from the Met. I know that Ben, you touched earlier on the disproportionality of some victims, especially disabled and LGBTIQ+ Londoners experiencing a disproportionate, poor satisfaction and service. But I didn't know if anyone wanted to talk to what more the Met could be doing to support victims.
And I think one thing is, and this has always been a challenge for policing, is to move away from a police-focused vision of what victimisation is to a victim-focused understanding of what victimisation is. And you see that right across the kind of the range of victimisation experiences. So people who experience low-level crimes, as we've just been saying, are pushed to report those online. They may want to, they may not, but it should be their decision how they report them. To people who have experienced serious sexual violence, where we know some of the limitations of police investigation of those kinds of crimes. And very often the systems and processes that are set up around these crimes are in place to help the police. For sometimes very understandable reasons, because they need to do the investigation, but without historically giving a huge amount of thought to what the victims want out of that process. And that's why things like Upsoteria and other efforts have been so important, because they have kind of refocused it and made a more victim-focused process.
I'd say there are two parts to this. One is the what kind of response the police give to the victims when they first come to report a crime. But also in terms of larger support to victims, it's a question worth asking whether victims want the police to support them or whether they want independent other outside agencies to provide that support, like IDVAs or like domestic violence supporters. So it may not be the role of the police to provide that support apart from actually giving them the service they deserve or they need. It's worth asking whether that kind of additional support throughout the criminal justice system might be better provided by someone outside the police. Because the police are driven by wanting to prosecute, and so they're almost herding victims towards the prosecution route always. And that might not be in the best interests of the victim. So if you take a victim-centered view of what the victim would want, then maybe the police are not the right agency to be providing that all-round support, except for providing the support for what they want the police services for, is what I would suggest.
Yeah, I would echo that, and we've got great examples where individual types of victims have that additional support, whether they be the ones mentioned or victim navigators that support victims of modern slavery. They're not in every police force, but they should be, because that third kind of party support is really important. And we know that, in fact, when they do get it, not that this is the desired outcome, but is a secondary outcome, that prosecutions rise as well, and they are more likely to kind of get to the root causes of these criminal behaviours and get the kind of linchpin of that network. And then just finally, I think a lot of this does probably lay outside of the remit of the police, as they help navigate people through the criminal justice system, the court backlogs people will be familiar with and the time that takes, and also often the kind of chaos that ensues, where court dates are shifted very quickly and with not much notice and are often years in the future. That is not something the police can really take responsibility for, but it unfortunately comes back on that police experience as well. So it's important that the national picture is taken into account too.
Some really good examples from all of you. Thank you. And then just quickly, is anyone aware of the Victims Hub that the Victims Commissioner in London has been recommending that hasn't been taken forward? I know there's a victims kind of like a desk, but there's not the full Victims Hub. I just didn't know if anyone was aware of that model. No. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, we're moving to our last section in panel 1, and it's delivery and performance, and it's being taken to start with by Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
Do the comments in the draft police and crime plan ensure safeguarding of children and young people? And if not, what else would you have added? Because in London we've had our challenges around safeguarding young people and particularly child cases, etc. We had the sort of adultification of young black children in particular. So when you read this plan, are you full of confidence about our path going forward? I'll start with you.
I think that as you said, the safeguarding issue is a huge one. I think what I would like to see more of in the plan is the preventative focus, which again is whether this is fully on the police to deliver is difficult because they will be part of a multi-agency approach to tackling that. But I do think that we've talked about kind of monitoring how this plan is effective and more kind of detail on what that is needed. Obviously everyone supports increased safeguarding, but what that mechanism actually is needs to be kind of added into that plan. So that's kind of all I would say on that.
Professor Belly?
Again, it's not really my area. The only thing I would add, and this is probably a much bigger point as well, I mean, the point about adultification is really interesting and important, and then some of that must come down to training of officers, which we've already discussed, but also just giving officers the wherewithal to think through these things as they go about their business in their practice. And I think police are very bad at doing that. I'm not sure the training's in place to deal with these issues, and even if it is in place, there's no time, there's no space, there's no opportunity to address that in the practice of frontline officers. So I guess there's a bigger question in all of this of how much we think what's in the plan is going to filter down to the front line where policing is actually done, and how that process is meant to unfold.
Professor?
I've nothing to.
Okay. When there's two things. One's about the training, because there's a tension between dealing with a young person who's committed a crime and the fact that they are a young person. You say the police are bad at that. I say it's a very, very tough call, a very tough call. And the other process is how much of this plan, which is maybe beyond the scope of this meeting, do the police believe in? Because if we go to your point about training, to enact many things in this plan, we'd have to affect training, and the plan simply it doesn't have that as part of its remit. So I'll come to you, Professor Bellew. What would you have liked to see to support children in London around this plan?
I'd like to see a clearer plan from the police themselves. So rather than this being a MOPAC strategy, the police deciding what they can reasonably achieve and what they want to achieve in that space. Because as with everything in policing, it's the senior leadership team's support that actually filters down to what is provided on the ground. So if supporting young people is not a priority with the senior leadership team, it's not going to be a priority. You can have any number of plans, you can have any number of oversight committees. So if a bit more detail about how they would provide that support and the resources and the support that the organisation at the senior levels would give frontline police officers would be, and it could be modest. It could be modest to start off with, but it should be sustained, and it should be over a longer period of time rather than we'll do it for 6 months and then take it away because something else bigger has come up. And this is... So it's a difference between chronic and acute problems. The police are responding to acute crisis rather than chronic crisis, which is a chronic crisis with young people, and the fact that they need proper interaction and proper safeguarding, which needs sustained resources to be devoted to that. And that needs the support of senior leadership, and it needs a plan within the organisation to do that. Unless that is reflected in the Met's plan, it's not going to be seen.
So that's one thing the mayor could affect, because he does hold the purse strings. Sophie, I come to you. It strikes me as one of the most important ways of supporting young people in London is the use of stop and search. And it is conspicuous by its absence in this plan in its entirety. Would you have liked to see some emphasis on A, it would be used, and B, how?
Yes, I would, and I think that reflects the views of Londoners. As mentioned before, the majority of them, 63%, want more use of stop and search, particularly when it's accompanied by a clear explanation by the officers of why it is happening. And in fact, support for stop and search has increased amongst young people, the 18 to 34 cohort, over the last 5 years, I think as a consequence of some of this messaging that has come alongside it, that saying how it can save lives. And when we speak to victims' families, unfortunately, who have gone through the most terrible, challenging and horrible times of their lives, what they often say to us is that they would like to see more, not less, police involvement in their communities around stop and search. And the support for stop and search, of course, we know that it has kind of used disproportionately on some types of ethnic minorities, but actually even those minorities themselves more support it than are against it, particularly in the young category, which is obviously where they are most personally affected by it. And just to briefly add to the point about the safeguarding issue, I think, yes, it is absolutely on the police, but one of the key issues on the kind of safeguarding and early flags of where there is warning is looking at the home environment. And members may be familiar with the Croydon cohort study, which looked at a cohort of 60 young people who had very high vulnerabilities to criminality. And when you see the kind of common experiences of their lives through their up to 18, the most common experience of them was that 72% of them did not have a parental father figure in the home, and that was the most common experience, coming first above domestic abuse, which was at 42%. So the safeguarding remit needs to be looking at the family situation, bringing in social services. Obviously that's beyond just what the police can do, but I think that's an important part of preventative measures on safeguarding.
Thank you.
I mean, my response to stop and search not being highlighted was, thank God, can we stop talking about stop and search? It's a totemic policy for practice or power for all the wrong reasons, in my opinion, which is not to say that I don't think the police should ever do stop and search. But there was a systematic review published on this a couple of years ago by really eminent American scholars, Global Reach, and they concluded that stop and search or stop and frisk like practices are minimally effective. In other words, you need huge increases in stop and search to have small decreases on targeted crimes. But very strong evidence that it damages trust and actually damages the mental health and sometimes physical health of the targeted communities. And they concluded from this that we can't just keep turning to stop and search as if it's a magic wand that's going to solve all our problems, because it never has and it never will. I mean, asking people whether they support stop and search in a survey is a bit like saying, do you support the police doing police work? Because it's become so closely linked to our understanding of how policing should take place.
But has it become so closely linked? Because it is so desired. I come from that community. I've been stopped to search 100 times. I know 5 people personally, one who's had 2 children murdered in their family, who would beg the police to do that. I used to be a member of 2 separate gangs, and when they are asked about stop and search, almost universally they added, that's why I'm armed, Sean, because I won't be stopped and I won't be searched. I'm clear to carry my weapon. So whoever, my worry is about the usual suspects. The usual suspects get to talk about gangs and stop and search and drugs from the safety of their lovely middle-class warm home, where the rest of us from my community are at the other end of that blade or that drug deal and die. So things that look tough to other people may well be tough, but to us they're a matter of life and death. That's why I asked the question. And Chair, just before I come back to you, it sounds to me that the police and crime plan should include something about how the police work with other agencies, because that seems to be the missing piece here.
Okay, I think we'll forever disagree on stop and search. I'm a massive supporter of it. I appreciate you're not, and we all come from different angles. We're running out of time, but we now have Assembly Member Best.
Thank you. And I would say, I think that exchange, even with your point of view, Ben, shows why it's crazy that stop and search isn't in the plan, because there should be a plan around it. I mean, so whatever your view, the Met should have a plan about how they want to use stop and search and make that clear to the public to increase trust and confidence. Sophia, I wanted to go back to the report you were involved in last year, where you talked about stop and search, but put a lot of emphasis on looking at the Glaswegian model of the Community Initiative to Reduce Violence, the CIRV. Not just talking about the propensity with which we use stop and search, but also the way in which it's used, and part of kind of that whole more systemic, holistic kind of intervention. What's the view on that and how that could be incorporated in the police and crime plan?
Yeah, I think what's really important to reflect the comments from the panel is that it is not used in isolation, and where it has been most effective is models from Glasgow, from Boston, from Cincinnati, where it is part of a kind of three-pronged approach where there is a very clear enforcement and very kind of academic studies have showed it is not necessary. The kind of deterrent effect is not actually on the harshness of the enforcement, it's on the clarity that it will happen. So the fact that someone's certain that it will happen is the biggest deterrent effect. But alongside the use of stop and search, it's very important that young people, which is predominantly kind of targeted on, have a route out of why they feel like their situation is not particularly kind of one that they want to continue. So whether that be through mentoring or education or employment opportunities, that is a clear route out. And alongside that as well, engagement with community leaders is a really important asset. So it can never be used in isolation. And what I think is damaging is if there are quantitative targets for stop and search. That is not something we want. That creates frustration within communities where people are searched just to fill data quotas. That is very dangerous. But a clear explanation of every time that it is used and a clear public messaging from the top about why it is important needs to be part of why it's effective. And unfortunately, the learnings from what happened in Glasgow and Cincinnati and Boston saw a 63% reduction in youth homicides over the trial that it did this kind of three-pronged approach of stop and search, education and community involvement and engagement. When it was transposed to London almost a decade ago, Operation Shield, that enforcement underpinning was not transposed in quite the same way. So unfortunately, it didn't have the results that it should have done because it didn't come with that robust kind of second and third prong of the plan, which was the stop and search element.
Thanks. And I'll come to you again, Sophia, and then other panellists. But something we've talked about in this committee in the Assembly often is scan and search, and where that could perhaps take a place in the police and crime plan and in wider policing, obviously eliminating the kind of more physical contact, but also making sure that the search is tracing knives, guns, dangerous weapons. Is that something that you've looked at or seen any effectiveness on or would support?
Not looked at it in detail, but I do think what is difficult to measure from stop and search and would be the same from scan and search is the deterrent effect of those who therefore do not carry. So it's not worth, you cannot just measure the number of kind of knives or weapons or other kind of illegal things removed. You also need to try and quantify the deterrent effect, which is very difficult to put numbers on. So I think scan and search will have a big impact on that. We know that happens with knife arches, for example. So I think that is part of the consideration. And as we've said, this plan unfortunately doesn't kind of focus on that, and I think that is missing.
Thanks. I don't know, does any professors want to?
I mean, I think the whole stop and search debate just from this exchange seems to be more in terms of it has effectiveness, so it actually reduces people carrying weapons, or whether it just improves public trust and confidence. So people would like the police to be stopping and searching, and that just gives them confidence that they are. So it's slightly difficult to disentangle, because studies have shown that more stop and searches actually ends up with black communities or minority ethnic communities feeling more disenchanted with the police. On the other hand, you seem to suggest that your experience says they actually want more stop and search. So obviously there are differences within what communities want, and stop and search might actually add to just reassuring people that the police are out and about, it may or may not actually reduce people carrying crime, or as Sophia says, we can't measure the deterrence effect, but the impact studies have shown on public confidence or public trust in the police in some communities goes down with increased stop and search. So it's a slightly sort of.
Murders bring
I was going to,
that down as well.
I think.
Can we keep to the police and crime plan, please?
Importantly, that comparison is looking at homicides and violent attacks as well, which I would argue is great as we want our confidence and trust to be. We want to reduce murder and serious incidents. Just one final follow-up on this. Sophia, around the police cadets, obviously one of your recommendations was an increase in the police cadets and expanded. Unfortunately, we're seeing a massive reduction in the police cadets. Is that something that you would like to see reversed?
Yes, definitely. We know that that has a really positive impact on young people who can have that mentorship, that purpose, that community engagement, and particularly we think it should be focused on children and young people who have been excluded or at risk of exclusion, because we know the very sad, often not predictive, but often pipe way that people with those experiences then follow in terms of becoming a victim or a perpetrator of crime. And also important that these police cadet programmes are embedded in schools. We've talked about the importance of what the public want in seeing police engage with schools, and also just the wider youth offer is really important. So more sport, more community provision, not asking schools to deliver that, but bringing in grassroots organisations that are doing it already, but making it in a more systematic way, which is low cost, but also keeps young people off the streets in that crucial window of the kind of 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. window where often a lot of violent crime is committed, and also provides that key mentorship and role modelling, which is so key for young people often looking to escape from a very kind of deprived community.
Thank you. And just one final question on the emphasis on the data science team and using the data. We had a discussion already about the neighbourhood policing data. Is there anything that either of you would like to add on that element?
The only thing that I saw, and it was on the list of potential questions that were circulated beforehand, was this idea of using forecasting as a way of measuring performance, and that seems odd to me. I mean, I can absolutely see why you would want to try and forecast crime that's going to happen in the future for lots of good reasons, but to then tie that to a performance measure seems odd, because A, it's just a forecast, but B, what you're forecast, you go into a kind of sliding doors world where you forecasted a crime is going to increase, you divert resources to that crime, it doesn't increase by much as you thought it was going to, so you've said you've been successful. Well, what crimes have you diverted resources away from? Does that mean that your forecast in relationship to those crimes has also changed? Do you know whether, if you hadn't diverted resources, that crime would have gone down anyway because there's a regression to the mean or whatever? That seems like an odd thing to be saying, and I'd want to know much more about how that's going to work before schemes like that are brought online.
And the other issue is using data modelling to identify at-risk perpetrators and all is really great, but it's then what do the police do with the results of that data modelling? So there are lots and lots of these algorithms and models being used, and it's spitting out answers, but then there's very little information about what actually then happens with the results of that data modelling. So using data modelling is not wrong or right per se. It's just what then is done with the outcome of that data modelling. That's really important, and that there's lack of transparency around that.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Thank you. Well, I would really like to thank the first panel and our guests for attending this morning, and your answers were so interesting and certainly given us food for thought going forward. Thank you. So we're now going to take a short break while we change panels. We will reconvene at 11:30. Thank you. Welcome back to the London Assembly Police and Crime Committee. I'd like to welcome our second panel of guests, John Hayward-Cripps, CEO Neighbourhood Watch, Nahar, I hope I've got that right, Chowdhury, Chief Executive Officer of Solace, and Stephen Walcott, Senior Researcher at Runnymede Trust. And on Zoom, we are joined by Louise Holden, who is the Senior Policy Officer of Inclusion London. So can you hear me, Louise? Excellent, jolly good. Right, our first question is from Lord Bailey, but he's had to nip out, so I'm going to ask you. In your experience, what are the main policing and crime priorities for London, and where should the Mayor prioritise police resources over the next 4 years? So I'll start with you, John, and work my way down, and then if there's anything different, if you could add that.
I think what's outlined in the plan is a clear sort of prioritisation, and I don't think I would disagree with anything that particularly that's in the plan. I think some of the detail, I mean, from my own organisational basis, the kind of increase focused on community policing, I think is really clear, or neighbourhood policing, and I think the aim to not draw away officers to other important issues at a time has been a priority for some time. It's kind of how that will actually work and how in-depth that will be, I think, is one of the areas that we think should be prioritised, because if there's a priority which we would agree with in terms of increasing confidence in the police, and that's not a straightforward issue and will take time, but I think neighbourhood policing is a clear way of doing that, but it will require investment and time and officers not being drawn away to other issues. I think that's probably where I would start. Yes, of course, and we see by the draft budget it looks like at the moment we could lose 2,300 officers, and I fear, I mean, I'm with you on this, I think neighbourhood policing is so vital. Now, have you got anything that you would like to have seen in there?
Yeah, I mean, we very much welcome the police and crime plan in terms of violence against women and girls. There is lots of provision in there. We do feel it, however, lacks the detail, and we are waiting for the tackling VOG strategy that's due to come out. So we're hoping there'll be more in there. But I think in terms of the priorities that have been outlined, agree with my colleague, but particularly around prevention in terms of perpetrator programmes, that's very positive, and particularly around as well in terms of the focus on tech abuse. So I think for us, we are really clear that the violence against women and girls is hugely complex, and even though this is very positive in terms of the scale and complexity of the issues our women are facing, the variety of kind of commissions and inquiries that have been in terms of the police and the kind of search around the criminal justice system. So we welcome all of that, but we just feel that it's there isn't enough detail really. So we would like to kind of feed that back. But as I said, we are waiting for the VOG strategy. Yeah. So I hope that makes sense.
Which, of course, is due out soon, isn't it? Yeah. Stephen.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the plan broadly reflects and matches where harm is most prevalent, particularly from the perspectives of communities of colour. When you think
Sorry, can I ask you to put your microphone? So you've got such a lovely soft voice, and it's not being picked up. Thank you.
It's not the first time I've had that. Yeah, it broadly matches where harm is most prevalent, particularly among communities of colour. So when we think about serious youth violence and violence against women and girls, we advocate for an intersectional approach to that, given the harm is disproportionate. I think having this conversation has to always, from our perspective, start with the Casey review, which obviously found the Met to be institutionally racist, institutionally misogynistic and homophobic, which of course results in the different treatment of communities of colour. We know that communities of colour are disadvantaged already in so many different ways, and the police can exacerbate those structural inequalities, including structural racism. So when we talk about where police resources should be prioritised, we actually advocate for a broader societal reorientation towards a system that's rooted in care, in community, and away from discriminatory systems and institutions. So to address the harm of, for example, serious youth violence and violence against women and girls, we urgently need to create adequate provision of investment in community-led projects which aim to reduce the harm in communities through, for example, healthcare, mental health support, education, accessible early years support, meaningful employment opportunities, and we need to kind of design broader structures in fundamentally new ways to address the harm, which presumably this plan has at its heart.
So you'd like to see far more of that in the plan?
We'd like to see more better understand. I think there is some understanding, but of how harm can be prevented more broadly. Therefore, kind of not ensuring that a police response or an enforcement approach is the go-to approach for some of these really complex forms of harm.
Yeah. I think one of the problems they're going to have is if there are 2,300 officers down, things such as the various things you've said are going to be a real problem because they're going to have to do basic, just, you know, basic policing. Louise, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Great, yeah. Well, I think in general terms, it was really helpful to be listening to the first panel. At Inclusion London, we used to have a really diverse group of organisations that could feed into the last consultation on the previous plan. And a lot of it is still the same, and we would still make the same recommendations. I think just cursory looking through, the word disabled is mentioned 3 times, vulnerability 23 times, but there's no clear disability action plan, there's no clear pathway to actually looking at any data collection on the impact of disabled people. And I think we would say that across all of the priorities, it's really important to have an intersectional lens and look at the intersection of disability and the black community, violence against women and girls. Disabled people are twice as likely to be a victim of violent crime, and there doesn't seem to be any response to that in this plan, and it was the same as the previous plan. So I think in general terms we have a concern that with the new boards that have been set up, with the police London Policing Board, and then you have the other boards about the disproportionality board, and that there isn't any real opportunity for us to input into that or to critically evaluate anything that they're doing. So what I found really interesting with the academics is that they've picked up the same as us, that they're, even though there's lots of new initiatives and really good pockets of work, there's never really an investigation into the effectiveness and how they're going to continue that. We're continually bombarded with new initiatives. We can't see whether they've been effective or not. And even if they're not effective, they're still used as a response to what the issue is without really listening to the community that it's impacting.
Thank you, and that does reflect what we heard this morning, doesn't it, or earlier on today, and I share your concerns about the disabled, so thank you for making those points. Assembly Member Duval.
Thank you. Can we just address ourselves to the issues around knife crime? So to what extent do the commitments in the draft police and crime plan respond to the challenges around knife violence and knife-enabled robbery in London? And what more is needed, if you get my drift towards the end? So it's a question to you all. So we start with John first.
Hi, I mean, to be honest, I would say that in terms of Neighbourhood Watch, apart from in its broadest sense, that's not an area of expertise of our organisation. I mean, what our members would say is that that would be an issue, and local initiatives such as knife sweeps in certain areas and those sort of things, which our members regularly take part in, would be something that we would encourage, and particularly around the kind of reporting, but that's a much broader issue in terms of general reporting. So I think that's something that I'll probably pass to my colleagues. That's not something that I have expertise on.
Fine. No.
Can you put your mic? Sorry, can you put your mic?
Sorry.
That's all right. Don't worry.
I mean, it is in our area of expertise, but we do kind of welcome the plan's public health approach generally. And I suppose from our point of view, we'd like to see more focus around misogyny in terms of one of the critical areas for violence against women and girls, and obviously that does link to your question. And we were really pleased to see the mayor's approach under his last term in terms of the wider measures around education and young people, and we would like to see more specifics around that. I mean, we from our work we know that over 60% of boys have access to posts in terms of misogyny. We know that the public's faith in terms of schools just being able to deal with this is very low. We do work around kind of peer-to-peer violence, but again, the funding situation around these areas is poor, and in terms of this competitive nature in the VORG sector in terms of working with young people around these issues is very, very difficult in terms of kind of having sustainable work. So, I hope that's helpful.
And Stephen?
Yeah, so from Runnymede perspective, we know that young black men are disproportionately likely to be involved in serious youth violence, and that's broadly seen as knife-enabled crime. There are complex reasons behind this, and I think it's important to recognise that this doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's due to structural inequality and racism, rather than inherent propensity to violence, which is portrayed in some kind of political and media circles. I think that's an important starting point. However, we recognise the significant harm of serious youth violence, and the harm that causes individuals and communities, but we think it's important not to overstate its extent to justify heavy policing and the surveillance of black communities. The shift towards addressing the root and structural causes of serious youth violence is obviously mentioned in the plan, which we welcome, such as mentions of education, of employment opportunities. We're also pleased to see the emphasis on housing and how that the housing crisis, which disproportionately impacts communities of colour, can drive further harm and in some cases crime. But there are 2 or 3 key points that I just wanted to raise from our broad thinking on this area and relevance to the draft. The first point to make is that we're concerned that the national serious violence duty and the community safety partnerships are responsible for delivering or disproportionately surveil and criminalise people of colour. That is something that's spoken about in the draft London plan. We recognise that the mandating local non-police services to share information and to monitor people suspected of being involved or at risk of serious violence can result in over-policing, even if that policing is not being done by the police. And I think that is a key thing that we're very aware of, is the encroachment of policing activities to other social and public services. Doing so enables racist assumptions to thrive and risk treating people with suspicion prior to any tangible evidence that any harm or crime has been caused. So it represents a shift in public and social services towards looking at the people that they're interacting with through a lens of criminality. I think it's worth talking about the serious violence duty in the same conversation as broader policies such as Prevent, which has seen huge cases of discrimination and also kind of broader hostile environment policies which mandate sharing of data between public agencies about people's migration status. And there's lots of evidence to show that has kind of led to a mass surveillance across many communities of colour, and I think the serious violence duty can continue that trend. The other point I wanted to raise was, and I recognise it's important not to always conflate serious youth violence with drug policing. and we recognise the harm caused by illegal drugs. But our broad position is that the Misuse of Drugs Act is not fit for purpose and enables disproportionate policing of communities of colour. So we welcome the harm reduction approaches that are kind of touched upon in the report, but realise that these are mentioned in the same paragraph or point about tough enforcement action, and that raises some concern for us. And clearly, that enforcement would be, I would imagine, be kind of directed towards drug dealers, but we remain concerned that just approach broadly will inevitably criminalise young street dealers who have been potentially been exploited and therefore have a disproportionate impact on communities of colour. So we welcome also the mention of the Independent London Drugs Commission on Cannabis and look forward to the results of that and support a movement towards changing how we kind of speak and think about drugs in terms of decriminalisation of personal possession.
And Louise?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's not really our area. We tend to have a victim focus, but I think there are victims involved in with defendants in terms of having a disability. So I want to draw the panel's attention to the Equality and Human Rights Commission report that was in 2020. And its main recommendations are around NH screening service for defendants to identify any disability like being neurodivergent or having a learning disability and having joined up information between agencies. And it's really important for disabled defendants to have access to intermediaries and special measures, so independent advocacy. Just because there's a disproportionate number of disabled people in the criminal justice system that was identified in that report, and I think it's really helpful for the Mayor's office to take that on board.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to pass back to the chair now.
Thank you. Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
Excuse me. What are your main policing and crime priorities for London, and where should the Mayor prioritise the policing resource?
Are you on question? You're doing question 12.
Oh, excuse me.
I'll tell you what. We'll come back to you in a minute. Assembly Member Garbutt.
Thank you. Stephen, just to pick up on some of the comments that you were just saying, because I have been, in the first panel I spoke about taking a public health approach to tackling drug harm and quoted that the Faculty of Public Health and the Royal Society of Public Health support it. But I just wanted to pick up on some of the comments you just made, and invite you to make any more comments on the police's approach through Project Adder, because when I last spoke to the Met Commissioner, he did make the statement that they arrest addicts, and obviously that is clearly not taking a kind of public health supportive approach. So any comments you had on that? Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'd agree with your position on that, talking about talking in terms of about language which is stigmatising is a real problem. I think this is worth another conversation after today's meeting, because it's work that we're doing at the moment, and but I'm happy to provide kind of more evidence around that, because our thinking is not only just about how different drugs impact different communities of colour and the impact of criminalisation of drugs, but also the way in which they're enforced and how certain drugs are policed at disproportionate to the harm that they could cause, which has a disproportionate impact on the communities of colour.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
I'll come to Assembly Member Best, and then I'll go back to Lord Bailey.
Thank you. We were talking in a previous session about different ways in which we could approach stop and search to make sure that the tool is used as effectively as possible. Any members of the panel want to add to that conversation on how you think it can be used effectively as a tool? Steve?
I mean, again, it's not a focus for Solace as a service delivery organisation in terms of domestic abuse, but I did want to, if I may, and if this isn't the appropriate time, I can wait for the appropriate time. But I suppose from our point of view, we did want to respond in terms of the focus on perpetrator programmes. But Madam Chairperson, should I wait until those the appropriate
I think wait,
time,
and if there's anything at the end of the questions that you particularly want to bring up, very happy.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think despite efforts to use stop and search more fairly, we're really concerned about the harm of stop and search broadly. I think the conversation should be about Section 60 and about pace searches. We call for the repeal of Section 60. We think the low find rates and the disproportionate harm on communities of colour far outweighs its success and serves no or very minimal preventative use. Our research shows that stop and search, as I said, has a minimal impact on serious violence. It's harmful and traumatizing and can actually increase the likelihood of engaging in unlawful behaviour regardless of any previous unlawful behaviour. So our position is that it does more harm than good, and we'd actually like to see us move away from the use of stop and search and focus more broadly on how we can prevent the things that stop and search is attempting to address.
Yeah, so just more on basically that's a conversation we were having about the tools, right? So stop and search being one of them, but for example, moving to or looking more at stop and scan or facial recognition. So I think if there's a tool from the police, is the position just we don't want them to use that, or do you have an alternative? Because it has been effective in some circumstances. So surely you must have an argument for how it would be better replaced if the argument is you don't want it used.
I think when we think about when we think about the alternatives, such as you said, facial recognition or stop and scan, the evidence shows that any form of policing or surveillance as such will have a disproportionate impact on communities of colour, particularly black communities. So our position is that we need to kind of reconsider what stop and search is trying to do. And in the case of, in London, a lot of the rhetoric is around finding knives or finding drugs. And actually, we need to look beyond that. We need to look at why children might carry a knife. These things don't exist in a vacuum. And policing, such as stop and search, individualizes the problem rather than recognizes the social and material conditions in which a child or anyone might engage in unlawful behavior.
So you wouldn't be recommending stop and scan or be in favour of facial recognition either?
We wouldn't if it has a disproportionate impact on communities of colour, which the evidence does show.
But obviously crime having a disproportionate effect on the murder rates. We've heard earlier how some in the community really do feel like these are tools there to protect the community and reverse that trend of the disproportionate rate, for example, young black boys experiencing murder or being murdered. That's the disproportionate rate we should all be focused on, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We should be focused on that disproportionate rate, but to solve that problem, the police will not be able to solve that problem. That problem is because there are significantly high rates of poverty among communities of colour in London. There are other problems around lack of opportunities, the housing crisis. All of these manifest in serious youth violence and other forms of harm. We can't individualise the problem. I think it's also important to recognise that the harm of serious youth violence disproportionately lies among black communities, but we should use similar or the same tools as when violence is disproportionately perpetrated by white communities. So if we look at Glasgow, for example, which was coined as the murder capital of Europe at one point. The way in which they brought down serious youth violence in Glasgow was through predominantly a public health approach which looked at preventative measures. There was some emphasis on stop and search, but there's no evidence that that would work for the same situations in London and on different communities of colour.
Absolutely, just recognising that the Glasgow approach did have a specific emphasis on stop and search, and it did work. So, and I would just state that I do think it's important to make this individual, because these are individual cases, right? These are individual children that have been murdered. And so if there's evidence and tools the police can use to stop those individuals being murdered or to catch their perpetrators, they absolutely need them. Thanks.
Can I just come back on that again?
Can you be brief?
Very briefly, yeah. I mean, the evidence shows, the evidence is clear that stop and search has a very minimal impact on reducing and preventing serious violence. That's not just one piece of evidence, that's lots of evidence bases.
I'd go as far to say it's contested and you've got a view, but there's a lot of evidence it does, and I know there's evidence that you would cite that suggests it doesn't. So we could go as far as saying it's contested. To suggest that the evidence is conclusive, I think is wrong.
Okay, there's many different views on this, as you can imagine, I'm sure. Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
Thank you. You talked about stop and search and over policing of the black community, and my colleague asked you about alternatives. And you said that you liked in the plan that there was some support around diversions. Do you think there's enough in this plan to provide the other part, the public health part of this approach? Because I agree with my colleague, the Glasgow model worked because it had a very strong enforcement piece. You would probably suggest that we have enough enforcement going on, particularly around stop and search, but do you see enough of the other half of this intervention that's needed?
I don't think I commented on diversion specifically, but your broader question around enough being done on the public health approach, I would say no. I think I recognise that this is quite limited. It's a broad plan, but it's limited in terms of how it addresses broader harm and broader structural harm, and the responsibilities of other areas of our governance system to have responsibility for those. I think it could be there could be stronger emphasis on how other agencies, such as kind of who's responsible for housing or for education, employment, etc., view kind of essentially are anti-racist. I think if there was an emphasis on those being anti-racist, then we would see a reduction in the harm that manifest individually as on communities of colour. So I'd like to see more cross-sector working, but and clear that should be non-police led.
So the use of the term anti-racist would suggest that you think much of the police activity, or particularly stop and search, and do not let me put words in your mouth, clarify if I'm getting this wrong, is racist in and of itself?
The Casey report says that the Metropolitan Police is institutionally racist. Yeah, that will manifest as racism on the streets.
I mightn't agree or not. I'm talking about the actual use of police, because this police and crime plan is trying to help the police direct its activities. I'm asking, are you suggesting that certain activities that are in this plan could be, I don't want to make it controversial, could be more anti-racist? Is that what you're saying? That they could do more within the structure of this to help the black community?
I think my comments on stop and search suggest that. I think there's loads of evidence to suggest that stop and search falls disproportionately on communities of colour, and there are more adverse experiences of stop and search, particularly among black communities. So yes, the continuation of that will be harmful.
Okay.
And
I just want to clarify without putting words in your mouth. So, but to what extent do you think that the black community could and should do more to police those crimes? And because somebody has to police those crimes, should the plan be asking for the community to involve itself more to police those crimes? Because it is black children who are being murdered, largely by other black children. It isn't just poverty. Believe it or not, there's communities in London that are even poorer than the black community. The Bangladeshi community leaps to mind, and they don't have anything like the murder rate amongst our young people that we do. So with that in mind, should the plan ask for more cooperation from the black community, or should it just lean more heavily into policing itself?
I would never put the emphasis on certain communities or certain individuals. I think the point I'm trying to make broadly is that the current approach to policing and to solving some of these forms of harm that fall disproportionately on communities of colour will not be addressed sufficiently, or if at all, by the police. The police is a responsive service, and we need to prevent harm in communities, and that means addressing all the social and material conditions in which violence can thrive.
I'm not going to lay put. I will come to you, but the mayor's remit is wider than the police in a sense. He has a social aspect, hence he tries to get involved in diversion programs, etc. And I'm asking, is it just the police who should be providing these answers for the black community, or should the black community get involved? But I think we'll have to park that. I just want to quickly come to you, John, because you seem to want to make an intervention.
Yeah, I'll just make a brief point around that. I mean, I think in terms of the diversion and the emphasis on diversion, I know sort of MOPAC and other organisations support the Youth to Adult project in Newham, and those sort of projects and a kind of wider rollout, I think, would be particularly useful in addressing lots of those things that the police by their. It's obviously not run by them, and it shouldn't be, but their kind of overt support for those, I think, is really important. And I think even where that makes life slightly tricky for the police, because obviously the remit of those sort of programmes is much broader, but the kind of support for that, even though they might like 80% of it, not 20%, I think those sort of things are really important in terms of increasing confidence and that diversion element around serious youth violence. I mean, certainly I take that because some of our members are involved in that project and say, that should be a wider rollout of projects like that to help address that, and the community being involved. But that needs the support of not to be held by the police, but very strongly supported by.
Okay, I think that's a role the mayor could get involved in. I think you're correct.
Yes, if I'm...
Go
just
ahead.
in terms of, sorry, just to contribute to that. I mean, I think we've all said that there needs to be a public health approach, and I think that's what I said at the beginning was that, but it seems to be very light, the plan around that. I think that was your question in terms of, no, of course it's not just about in terms of the police, but I think just adding to what my colleague was saying, our experience in terms of violence against women and girls is there is rock bottom confidence in the police in terms of the area of work that I'm in, but also in terms of black women, migrant women, there is rock bottom confidence in the police. So in terms of the solutions that you're talking about, I think we absolutely, well, I'm not talking on behalf of anyone else, agree that there needs to be a wider approach in terms of public health, and that's what we very, very supportive of. But we need far more detail, and as you said, I think it's very difficult to answer questions about what communities can do. I think that would be very difficult for any of us to answer. But we've all been here before, so I suppose it'd be really interesting to see what is the detail in terms of bringing in these communities and working with them. Because from our perspective, which is very specific around violence against women and girls, there is there seems to be very little progress in terms of supporting those particular communities in their interaction with the police.
So you want in the plan more direct detail about how to interact, how those communities, particularly your community, I want to focus on violence against women and girls, how women suffer who've been a victim in that, how they seek support. You'd like to see more detail of that. Am I reading that correct?
And yes, to a degree, but I think I said at the beginning that we're hoping and expecting in the VORG strategy, tackling VORG, to have more detail of that, which we're expecting soon. So the detail of that is that we hope will be in there. But I think going into an area that isn't a special, it's not a specialism for Solace, is that yes, there has to be more detail in there. You're asking the questions, well, what can this community do? What are the other solutions in terms of various tools around measuring violence and supporting the police? But there isn't any other detail in there. It's very difficult to comment on this plan because of its lack of detail.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Just make a comment. Weirdly, I studied the Glasgow initiative as part of a degree that I was doing with the Open University, And it was absolutely vital to have all of the elements in place. And I think what I'm hearing is that we hear of an initiative that's been successful somewhere else, it gets tried out, but it's watered down. And that happens a lot with the Met Police. They see an initiative that they see is working somewhere else and they will implement it, but it's not quite the same and it won't have the same effect. And the thing that was absolutely vital with the Glasgow initiative was that it had a holistic, coordinated response that involved employment, education, health, that were properly resourced and supported, and the whole family was involved. When the defendant or perpetrator was being supported through their conviction, they had options of whether they were going to get into part of the criminal justice system or they were going to work on a solution with their family. And a lot of them were, agreed that that's what they would do. So they were given an option. So you can't just have this discussion about it has to have more meat on the bones, which is, I think, in the report, just saying we're going to have a public health approach isn't enough. There's no accountability.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, all of you, for that. The next question's more or less been covered, so we'll go now straight on to Assembly Member Ahmed.
Chair, thank you. I think my question has also
It
been
really
very
is.
eloquently covered as well.
Yeah,
So
okay. You've been very helpful and been answering questions that were coming next, so thank you for that. And this next one is pretty much covered, but I will ask anyway. Disabled, LGBTQ plus disabled black men or black and mixed ethnicity Londoners report lower levels of trust and confidence in the Met. You've already said that, especially Stephen. And is there any specific wording in the plan that you wish you had seen, specific?
No, I wouldn't have said there's any specific wording I would have liked to have seen, no.
Okay. Are you're aware of the Chris Carber case? Do you think that's actually impacted Met trust and confidence?
I think any significant incident or event that happens has an impact on trust and confidence in the police broadly. I don't want to comment on the specific case, but broadly speaking, trust and confidence is inevitably low among black communities, given the treatment of Child Q, for example, Nicole Smallman, Bieber Henry, and others, and into everyday interactions with the police. So, inevitably.
And of course, it had a bad impact on the Met as well, and how they felt, because they felt their chap had been dealt with very badly. So I suppose that doesn't help community tensions in that way, because both sides feel aggrieved.
Yeah, I don't want to comment on any specific case.
Naha, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just in terms of, as I said before, that from our survivors, Solace is the second largest service delivery organisation in the country in terms of domestic abuse. In terms of those groups that don't feel confidence in the police, I mean that goes across all our ethnicities in terms of our client group. But obviously we've seen some cases in terms of police perpetrated abuse, and our survivors are telling us in terms of the migrant women that that they feel that the fact that they have no recourse to public funds, for example, that's often some of the cases that have been in the press more high profile in terms of that being kind of weaponised, and also this kind of inconsistent approach from the police in terms of their lack of understanding and their lack of knowledge. So we've called for with some of our sister organisations in terms of it came up recently in Parliament in terms of Valerie's law, in terms of having more cultural understanding of various various communities. So I think it does have to be addressed. There does need to be more detail. And as I think we've mentioned before, that there was some really good work done in the last term in terms of the mayor, and we would really like to see some leadership in this area. But then absolutely, we need to see targets. So you can't have targets on everything, but there could be targets around in terms of reporting. And again, we hope to see that in the next strategy that we're waiting to see.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Garbett, you wanted to come in under this?
Yeah, thank you. Just specifically, really, to give Louise the opportunity to speak a bit to disabled Londoners' experiences of hate crime. And I know you've already mentioned, Louise, in the first time you spoke about the lack of an action plan to address hate crime. And I know we've had conversations about this, but I just wanted to give you some space to just speak a bit more to that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think in general terms, we've been working really closely with MOPAC and the Met Police for a number of years to really look at the impact of disableism in the Met. And despite it being identified in terms of discrimination in the Baroness Casey report, it wasn't called out as such. And unfortunately, because of that, we're not getting the same response in the Met. So it's, I think what we've found is that with the new boards that are in place and then the action plans that are attached to that, there is just nothing there that is of any relevance to the disabled community in terms of improving their experience with the Metropolitan Police. And we really call for a disability champion across MOPAC and London Assembly to bring focus to disability issues. Violence against women and girls is a really good example because there is no specific actions around disabled women experiencing domestic violence and sexual violence. So they're twice as likely to experience those crimes, but there isn't the response in the report. So without having that intersectional lens, these things are missed. And unfortunately, despite the report saying that it's going to have an intersectional approach, we can't see any work that is reflecting that. So it's just words.
Thanks, Louise. That was really clear with some really clear recommendations. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
It was very clear, and I actually really agree with you. It's vital that we take disability far more seriously on so many things. Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
No, you made comments about the cultural sensitivity of the police, etc., when dealing with survivors in the work that you specialise in. Do you actually think... I could be going a bit far here, but I don't think the police are capable of that because of their wider remit and what they have to do. But you and your sister organisations are. Would you have liked a plan that almost placed you in that position, not you as an individual, you as an organisation, to provide that advocacy piece? Because to my mind, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems that you would be better suited to creating that advocacy piece than asking the police to do it.
I mean, just to make sure I answer the question, I mean, organisations like Solace do provide the advocacy piece in terms of independent domestic violence advocates and independent sexual violence advocates. So we do that. But I suppose what I was referring to earlier is this very inconsistent approach. I mean, you do have some really good examples of policing, but they are at the front line. They are dealing with the survivor, and there's kind of the work that we've seen is, as I said, it's inconsistent. It's poor in terms of cultural understanding. It's quite there's a lot of it's quite random in terms of the practice. So it might be that people are encouraged to go to a station to report domestic abuse, that they're asked to see a man, for example. So I'm not sure I fully understand, because I think we're playing that role anyway. But I suppose what our teams are saying is that you don't get one approach. And I suppose, again, from our experience of initiatives like Operation Soteria, which I really think is an excellent initiative, that's where we're seeing some of that cultural change. We'd really like to see that introduced for domestic abuse and not just sexual violence. But sorry, did I understand your question?
Correct, and I wasn't entirely clear. I think what I'm asking is how could you be pulled in almost more officially police, so there was a more even distribution, you know, of high quality work. That's what I'm saying, because I come from a youth work background, and I understand things are patchy and you're relying on a good individual or a well-funded project. I think the question I'm asking is, do you and other organisations of your ilk, do you know what you would ask of the Mayor to allow you to do more of the work you do, to be more consistently funded for a victim anywhere in London to be able to come across someone providing your services? Do you have a plan? Because if you have some kind of idea of how that works, then you could obviously give it to the Mayor. Because often I read the plan, and the plan has lots of nice words in it, but it has very little how. And I'm asking your sector, does it understand how, and could it present that to the Mayor?
Yes, absolutely. I think we could sit down tomorrow with organisations like Solace and tell you what model would be better for all Londoners to be able to safely report domestic abuse and sexual violence. You know, but the role of the police is so integral, obviously, in terms of the criminal justice system as well, and all the issues that we see about the delays, about women, you know, about the process decriminalising, you know, their concerns, and when they want to report. So it's not always just about reporting either. So yes, absolutely, there are enough people who, with the expertise, to be able to sit down. And I know this is separate, but we're also waiting for the detail of what the government have announced around eradicating violence against women and girls. But again, there seems to be lack of detail about what that looks like. But yes, in answer to your question, absolutely. That would not be an issue at all. So, and we'd very happily collaborate, which the sector does on a daily basis. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer, Chair.
Thank you.
Please,
Assembly Member Roberts.
Sorry, could I just come in really quickly on the points?
Just briefly, if you would.
It's really important, obviously, and I'm pleased we're taking an intersectional approach. It's important to recognise who isn't able to access the kind of services that we're talking about, and in that way, there are certain policies that can exacerbate harm for, in particular, migrant women. So the Istanbul Convention, basically Article 59 of the Istanbul Convention, prevents migrant women from accessing legal protections, and we would like to see the government reverse the UK's exemption to that article, which means that women whose status depends on a spouse or a partner can obtain automatic residence status if the relationship...
That's more government. We're really just looking at the Mayor's police and crime plan. We've got to keep focused on that because there's nothing we can do about it. And it's important that we just talk about things that we can affect.
Could I, sorry, Madam Chairperson, I just wanted to ask, just in terms of that London focus, is, you know, there is an issue that the DA, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, has raised, which is about data being shared between the Metropolitan Police in terms of insecure immigration status and the Home Office. And there has been calls in terms of having a national firewall that, again, you know, it hasn't been progressed. So I think that there is that piece of work that needs to be looked at. But also in terms of, you know, protection and an increase in funding. Lord Bailey mentioned funding. We do not have a sustainable funding model for violence against women and girls in London. As I said, it's very competitive. We would much prefer a grants process, a longer-term process. So I just wanted to raise that. Thank you.
You've made the point, and hopefully somebody will pick that up. But at the moment, we'll go back to the police and crime plan. Assembly Member Roberts.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question to Louise before I move on to my substantive. It's just relation to the police and crime plan references that new forums will be created for deaf and disabled Londoners to engage with the MPS, TfL and the London Fire Brigade to ensure their voices are heard in shaping the future of our city. What confidence do you have that these new forums will bring about genuine change and benefits?
Yeah, I haven't got a lot of confidence in those forums. It's being led by the people in power. We have been working with MOPAC on a co-production model for community engagement, which is obviously more difficult, and it's led by the participants. So it won't have it will have a different agenda set, but the people that I've been working with in MOPAC understand the benefits of it and how it can really improve services and support. So I have worked with a few representatives on how those forums are going to be set up, but unfortunately, unless we take a radical change into how the system, this system cannot solve the system's problems. We need to try a new way. And I'm really grateful to the community engagement team at MOPAC for recognising that. So I would strongly recommend that they work on a co-produce model instead of setting up more forums.
Thank you. Well, it's to be hoped that the Mayor will take notice of the unanimous vote within the Assembly to appoint a disability champion to drive this work forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is a question for John. It's regarding community policing. So what's needed most to tackle neighbourhood crime and antisocial behaviour in London?
Sorry, can you put your mic? Sorry, we all forget.
So there's a range of things. We would, as an organisation, in terms of the approach, using a public health approach across all of those areas of high harm crime is really important. But a key part of that then is involving the other statutory agencies and local communities, and I think that kind of pulls that into community policing and neighbourhood policing. I think as I mentioned earlier, having officers not being drawn away to emergencies, that could certainly be firmed up. So not that we aim that they don't really, but they won't be. Or that they, and also perhaps that they won't be transferred if an officer's given a local neighbourhood policing role, that they're not transferred for a couple of years or a period of time. That doesn't mean that they can't progress in terms of promotion, but they won't be pulled out of that. We have loads of cases where we start to make a relationship with local officers and then they move. And I understand officers need to be promoted and move on, but that equally has an impact on neighbourhoods. So I think that will be one area that could be specifically firmed up. I think also, I would. And this ties in with both the violence against women and girls and serious violence, but also locally around advocating a bystander approach to policing. I think that's something that could mobilise communities, mobilise ordinary people, can increase the confidence in the police, and is a simple and safe and straightforward way of doing that. And I think that's something that we would advocate very strongly. That's not mentioned, but we would advocate that very strongly. I think one of the other elements around this and ties in with the kind of confidence and again builds on the kind of strengths of the police locally, just their approach to clear, hold, build. We would advocate and think that is a good approach, but certainly we've done quite a lot of work with officers involved in that and the Royal College, that the build bit at the end is often that by its very element is this thing that happens at the end. It needs to happen right at the beginning. You can't build a resilient community that will kind of fill that space if organised crime has left unless you've been working on that for some time. It can't be the last 3 months of a clear hold build programme. It needs to be integral to that work right from the beginning. And certainly when we've worked with the Royal College of Policing, they absolutely advocate that, but in reality on the ground that's the bit that kind of gets added at the end, and understandably that's not what the police are great at, but that's the only way that model can work. Otherwise it's going to be an intervention, it's going to be clear and hold, and it runs for a bit and then we'll need to go back and do some clear and hold again, and that with the greatest respect to the police, that's not their skill set. They can help, and it ties in with what I was saying earlier, they can really advocate and support that, and what that community might build itself, they might like 80% of and not 20%, but that means the community will doing it, it's likely to have longevity, and that the police need to be positive advocates for that rather than needing to control that build phase. I think that it's a more complicated thing, as anyone that's worked in kind of community development and community resilience would know. It's not straightforward. It takes a bit of time, but for that programme to work in those areas of really high crime and serious organised crime, that's got to be an element of it from the beginning. It's got to be built from the beginning and then do the clear and the hold and the build. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. And the last point I would make on that, I've been to numerous meetings for neighbourhood watch groups, large and small, across London, and when senior officers come and explain the priorities and why certain things get priorities over others, our members and the sort of broader public, when they're at those meetings, understand that. They get that completely. And I guess my point would be around, in the report it says really clearly 878 million less in real terms since 2012. Okay, so some things aren't going to be a priority. And I think there needs to be a bit more of an honest explanation of that within the report, that some things aren't going to be a priority. They can't all be. There's huge demands on the police, which we understand. So some things aren't going to be a priority. So a degree of honesty, and at those local meetings with senior officers, they often have that kind of real honest, straightforward. Actually, there's a woman who's likely to be murdered in a domestic abuse, so my officer's going to go there rather than to a neighbourhood watch meeting. And everyone gets that. So those things, there are priorities, which means some things are less prioritised. And I think having a bit of an honest discussion and an acknowledgement of that is really important around confidence locally. And it's not that people don't get it. It's really difficult to do. And no, senior officers are never going to want to say, well, actually, we're going to not prioritise these. That's really, really difficult. But if we can have an honest discussion with local communities about why some things are prioritised and some aren't, that's got to be part of it. The public are grown up, they can understand that. It's difficult, but they can understand it.
Thank you. I mean, it sort of ties in to what Assembly Member Deval was mentioning in the earlier panel. Do you think there's enough focus on a sort of a community collaborative approach within this police and crime plan?
I think it depends on, it kind of ties in with what my colleagues have been saying. It depends on the detail of what those things mean. Yeah. And I'd go back to my point around officers not being drawn, neighbourhood officers not being drawn out to other things. If that is what actually happens, then yeah, there's a fair chance of it being successful. If that's kind of an aim, but because of all sorts of other priorities and emergencies, that's not what happens, then no, it's not going to. I do think, and this is not just Neighbourhood Watch, but I think there are numerous local community organisations across London that would be kind of ready, who are fairly supportive of the police. I wouldn't put it more strongly than that, but that's a good start, and those can be advocates. And if those organisations feel as though they are being heard and listened to and worked with by the police, then they will be motivated to be advocates for and mobilising that kind of community. That community view. And again, I would say maybe the police or the Met would like 80% of what they advocate, but not 100%. But I would say that's more than worth going for. And if those community organisations such as Neighbourhood Watch and others, be them faith groups or whatever, can be mobilised because they feel listened to and supported to, then I think in terms of confidence of the police generally in neighbourhood policing, all the benefits of that will rise. It's not a quick fix, but that absolutely should be what it's aimed for.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And John, I agree with everything you've just said. I've been involved in Neighbourhood Watch since they were talking about starting it. I don't know how many years, decades.
42.
God. No, I can't have been then.
I'm sure you weren't there right at the beginning.
Let's move on rather rapidly. God, it was years ago. Right, okay, I'm going to leave my question now because of time reasons and go on to our final question now, which is taken by Assembly Member Best.
Thank you. And I suppose it's just a wrap-up question really on the Police and Crime Action Plan. How would you like your organisations and those communities your organisations represent to be kept abreast or informed of how the action plan develops? And then obviously once it's confirmed, how would you like them and yourselves to be kept up to date and involved in progress? Perhaps if you want to go down the line.
Yeah, I mean, we had a bit of a discussion before, and we're not quite sure why we appeared here in the first place. So the kind of how that happens would be if it's a lottery, then that's a lottery, and we're here, and that's great. But I guess
because you're brilliant, that is why
we took that. We assumed kind of that, obviously. But I guess it's making sure that we remain at the table during those part of the process and being called upon for things that are relevant to us and not where we're not going to be able to add value, to not waste your time, our time. But I think to be included at the table for particularly volunteer and community organisations, and that's tricky, but that's I think how that would work for us.
I guess just to drill down on that, how do you value that being taken? Is that by days like today, or with the Mayor's office, coming in face to face, or is that more being asked for more substantial written evidence and then getting clear responses back to that?
I think it's both those things, but I guess I think a little bit like my colleagues, it's where the words and the interaction becomes reality, or that's the bit for me. If being involved then does get a clear response or an action, then that would be how we would feel as though it's worthwhile, even if it doesn't agree with what we're doing. But the reason we're doing this is because of X, Y, and Z, rather than what you said. But I think that can happen in forums like this or in written work.
Yeah, I would agree with my colleague. I suppose for us, in terms of getting updates, I mean, we're very pleased to be here as a service delivery organisation, but I suppose, you know, we use a very simple model in our organisation. Is if we do consultation on anything, we basically say what we're going to do. So you said we did, and we'd like to see more of that, but also we're very realistic. So if there are things we can't do due to finances, and I extend that to the wider org sector, we work very closely together with organisations like Refuge and Standing Together Again. We're very practical. So I think thank you very much. Really welcome this kind of opportunity. But if we could think about meaningful ways, and we're happy to support. I think Lord Bailey asked again, do you have a plan? I think there's lots of people who do have a plan in terms of within their own sector and how things could be more effective. So we would be very happy to kind of collaborate on that. I don't think some of the ways now that exist are particularly meaningful. But I think, you know, Solace has been asked a number of times now to be involved in various, whether it's today or around housing strategy locally, around the homelessness action plan. So we are seeing kind of improvements in terms of, you know, in terms of being asked to collaborate. But I suppose the missing part is, as my colleague was saying, we need that. In order for us to have credibility with our survivors and our workforce, we need to show what's changed. And I suppose that's the challenge. But thank you for the question.
Thanks. And just one follow-up on that as well. When you say some ways are less meaningful, is that almost where you haven't seen any change as a result of the input? And yes, perhaps, as you say, for reporting back, perhaps there's a better way of communicating why the change hasn't been input. So, you know, so you can at least communicate to your members and have an understanding of the representation you made and why it wasn't accepted, because therefore you could come with, you know, addressing those points the next time. Is that a puzzle that's been missed?
I think it is. I think, yeah, that is what happens a lot of the time. And the example I used earlier on about the firewall that between the Home Office and the Metropolitan Police, you know, that's been called for quite a long time now, you know, 2 or 3 years, as far as I'm aware, from the Domestic Abuse Commissioner. And I think there's no real response in terms of why such a practical, useful method to protect women hasn't been implemented. So if there's a reason, I can't think of a good one, but if there is, and if it's about resources, then so be it. But you tend to have the same conversations. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And Stephen?
Yeah, I'd just echo what was said about remaining at the table. I think the conversations are difficult, inevitably, and I think it's important to recognise that I hope we're all trying to work to the same purposes, which is harm reduction, but have different evidence bases about how to best do that. I think the point that the reality is that with the communities that we serve, engagement is going to be minimal, all the while there is minimal change that happens. We didn't get onto various other points, but while there's so many experiences of intrusion through, for example, strip search, or other discriminatory practices going on, I think you're going to really struggle to get any engagement from communities of colour because people are not happy with what's going on. I would also emphasise that I know an earlier point was made about the difference between national level issues and London-centric issues. I think a lot of the issues that are going on in London require a national strategy, and so it's remiss to not talk about the national landscape. I like the point about reporting back like reasons for change not happening, because yeah, that would be useful from our perspective.
Thanks, Stephen. And Louise?
I think being brave, going with the co-production model, getting lots of in-depth training about the social model of disability and the cultural model of deafness can really help. That's what galvanised the MOPAC community engagement team to really understand what was needed. I think there has to be a real shift in culture to victim focus. and there has to be a real shift to treating community agencies as just as equal as other agencies. So I mean, for a number of years, Inclusion London has been involved in consultations and responses across a wide range of issues, not just policing and crime. And despite we represent over 70 deaf and disabled people's organisations, each of which has a wide membership. You know, there's 1.2 million disabled people in London. We don't feel that we're listened to, but it's not responded to. So I would echo what the other panel members have said about having an explanation for why an action hasn't happened can be just as helpful as the action happening. But yeah, a radical transformation of how things are designed. It really has to go back to co-production. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, all of you. It's been really interesting to listen to things from different people's perspectives. I mean, some people we don't agree with. Some of us do, some of us don't. I mean, that's how it is. But it is always good to listen to other people's points of view. So thank you. Thank you very much for attending this morning and for your answers to the questions. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Thank you. Can we also note the committee's response to the Mayor's draft police and crime plan, and it will be agreed at a future meeting of this committee. Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note its work programme? The next meeting of the committee is scheduled to take place on Wednesday 29th of January at 10 a.m. in the Chamber City Hall. I have no urgent business, so that concludes today's meeting. Thank you.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.